So I was actually just talking with Todd and Harry here about the circumstances in which I moved from Northwestern to Stanford. This was in 2005, and I really had no idea I'd be here. I thought I was going to be in Chicago for the rest of my life. But when they invited me to come here, so one question I had was, what was my role going to be? And I remember asking my colleague Jeffrey Pfeffer, whom, of course, when I began my career 22 years ago, he was somebody we certainly looked up to. I still look up to him as a colleague and a friend now. And I remember asking Jeffrey, you have so many of these senior professors here. You want me also as a senior professor? What's my role going to be? And I'm sure for those of you working in corporations, this is a very salient question when you move. You want to know what your role is going to be. So Jeffrey looks at me and says, your role, Huggy, is to be you. And I thought, I could really do this. And it's very true. Since 2005, when I've actually been here, the time when I've been here, I really have been me. And what does that mean? It means doing research. It means teaching. It means being in seminars. And of course, it also means spending a wonderful year up the hill at a place called the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Science. So Princeton has something called the Institute for Advanced Study in the Natural Sciences. At Stanford, we have something called the Institute for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. So people from different fields come together. So one of the things there is you have to present your research. But how do you present your research to a very disparate group of individuals? From political scientists to economists to historians to whoever. And so I thought of giving a general account of the work I'd done for 20 years. And they said, you know what, you really ought to write a book for a general audience. I'd never done anything like that. And I thought, hey, why not? And the result, of course, is Market Rebels. Market Rebels has actually been a book in the making for a long time. It actually subsumes about 20 plus years of work that I've been doing, studying the role of collective action and how it shapes markets, industries, and the like. In today's talk, I'm primarily going to focus on how collective action shapes markets, but the arguments can easily be extended to understand how collective action also shapes innovation, particularly in hierarchies. So we can certainly engage in Q&A there. So let me quickly, I thought it would be very appropriate to begin with a wonderful line from Margaret Mead. She says, never doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that has. And how does this small group of people change the world? What they do is they really launch collective action that takes the form of social movements. So what's my main argument going to be? My main argument is it is not the invisible hand of the market or the visible hand of great men that shapes markets. Instead, it's actually the joined hands of activists. Who are activists? These are people who deeply care about a cause. Unlike most of us who are concerned about what it might cost to engage in collective action, activists are people who think about the costs of them not starting collective action. It's the other way around. So they're people deeply committed to a cause, a lot of emotional commitment, and it's the cause that essentially kind of pursues them. And these are people who, as the name Market Rebels implies, they actually defy convention. They question conventional wisdom, they defy authority, they take risks. What can they do? Market Rebels play a double-edged role in markets. On the one hand, they can help shape new industries, they can help create new niches, and on the other, they can also block or thwart innovation. They can do both things. So I actually want to establish this argument by offering you three, hopefully, compelling examples. One is a study of the early automobiling movement and how it actually established the automobile industry in America. The second is the microbrewing movement And the interesting thing about the microbrewing movement is it actually led to the creation of many, many new firms in an industry where concentration in terms of market share control by the big three in the United States is about 98%. So these are two roles where rebels really promote radical innovation. What do I mean by radical innovation? I interpret the term broadly. Radical innovation for me means innovation that actually changes, transforms, and challenges existing cultural norms. So when the electric car came, it shattered existing ideas of how to actually move about. It shattered existing ideas of transportation. The third example I'm going to offer actually is a very recent study that I'm doing with Paul Ingram, my collaborator at Columbia University, and Laurie Way, who's also a doctoral student there. And here, I want to give you a taste of an interesting example of how the anti-sprawl movement, in a sense, has had a huge effect on Walmart and its expansion. So, this is an example of rebels, as it were, blocking, if you will, innovation. From my point of view, I don't pass a value judgment on the content of an innovation, whether it's good or bad. I simply want to drive home the argument it's collective action that plays an important role. So, if you ask most people, how really was the automobile industry established in the United States? Most people would look at you and say, look, the answer is trivial. Really, it was Henry Ford who really established the automobile industry when he started mass production of automobiles. That's a reasonable question. This is, if you will, the visible hand question. You have a great man who helped establish an industry. Now, it is certainly true that Henry Ford played an important role in developing mass production. I should add that his ideas for the use of assembly line technology came when he observed meat packing plants, where you actually had an assembly line process there. And he thought, you could actually take this and port it over to automobiles. Now, the real question is not whether Henry Ford is a great person or not. Of course, he's a great person. The real question to ask is, what was it that made it possible for him to mass produce a car? In other words, what was it that actually created a mass demand for cars? That's the question we need to answer. And to really understand that question, let me take you back to 1895. I choose 1895 as the point of origin because for the first time, there was an entity, the Duryea brothers, and their production facility that actually made cars for commercial purchase. Lots of inventors were tinkering around with cars. There was a character called Ransom Olds who actually had an engine that eventually wound up, of all places, in Mumbai, India. Think about that. This was actually, in 1878, 1879. So go back to 1895, the Duryeas introduced the car. So my argument is going to be, it was what made it possible for the car to become widely accepted, to become an uncontestable dimension of American cultural life. What made mass demand possible was the automobiling movement driven by automobile clubs. So in fact, this was the reaction to the gasoline-powered car. When it first appeared, the reaction was, you can't get anybody to sit on an explosion. How could anybody buy a car like that? It's crazy. And when you go back to 1895, there was absolutely no consensus on what the car ought to be even called. Look at some of the names: motorcycle, velocipede, autocar, locomobile, gasomobile, quadricycle, and on and on and on and on. So, no agreement on what a car was. Very little understanding of technologies, particularly gasoline technology. Albert Pope, the president of the Pope Manufacturing Company, he was a producer of electric cars. He was the one who opined, you can't get anybody to sit on an explosion. And I'm not joking, there was even a bill in the Massachusetts legislature where one lawmaker suggested every motorist had to be equipped with Roman candles that ought to be fired at approaching horses so that the horses could be warned of the impending arrival of a car. I know, we're chuckling. We're thinking it sounds absurd, but I might tell you that it was a very real issue. If you actually look at the proceedings of the Massachusetts legislature, it's actually very amusing. They spent a lot of time debating it. The car was called a devilish contraption. That was the reaction to the automobile in 1895. Now, the other problem with the car was it was unreliable, notoriously so. In fact, most vehicles were actually designed with whip sockets and harness hitches. Why? Because if it failed, the horse could obviously rescue or retrieve the car. And it didn't help that manufacturers had, how shall I put it, very offbeat origins. So look at George Pierce. This guy began as a manufacturer of bird cages that led him to make spokes for bicycles. He made bicycles and then finally moved into automobiles. It's a strange kind of path of diversification, to put it mildly, Bird cages to automobiles. And advertisements were really very misleading. So if you read the Scientific American, it actually was published in those days, you will actually hear the editors complaining about the endless amount of nonsense being published. So you can imagine the picture. Devilish contraption, poor reliability. You can't trust any advertisement. Okay? That was the reaction to the car. How did the car become an uncontestable fact of American life, where nobody could raise a question about it? Here's how it happened. The other problem before we get to the role of the automobile clubs was there was a lot of opposition from anti-speeding interests. One group were the farmers. The Farmers' Anti-Automobile Society of Pennsylvania, for example, said automobiles traveling on country roads at night must send up a rocket every mile, then wait for 10 minutes before the road cleared, and then proceed forward. I know. Sounds absurd, but these were things that people at that time took very, very seriously. In fact, one of the rules these people wanted to impose, they actually were lobbying the legislature, was if a horse refuses to pass a car, the owner must take his car apart and conceal it in the bushes. I mean, think about it. It's all very absurd, looks laughable, quaint, but again, they're very real issues for these people. Before we get there, you also had pedestrians who were concerned about the speeding automobile. In fact, if you look at the history of the modern speed trap that American police are so well known for, who taught it to the cops? It was actually anti-speed vigilantes. They were the people who coined the notion of a speed trap. They taught the cops to nail a car traveling very, very quickly. Okay? That's the situation. So, at that time, if you asked anybody, would there be mass production of cars, what do you think people would have told you? Not really. Looks very slim. So, who could have actually helped change the situation? We could look at the role of government. But before we do that, I thought it would be nice to show you a picture of the Derriers. That's the original Derrier car of 1895, and that's the electric phaeton of wood, 1902. As you know, VW has actually used the name for one of their more recent cars. And this is, of course, the Stanley steamer, now connected with an eponymous carpet cleaning operation, so to speak. The Stanley steamer actually was an extraordinarily fast car. So, who could have actually solved this problem? One answer is, you really don't need activists. All that you need is a trade association. They can actually do all of this. And if you look at the history of trade associations in the American automobile industry, they simply collapsed. You had one called the Association of Licensed Manufacturers. And as their manifesto says, they wanted to prevent the incursion of piratical hordes who desire to flood the market with trashy machines. They wanted quality. And of course, they had a lot of internecine fighting and factionalism. They fell apart. There was a second association called the American Motor Car Manufacturers Association, but that didn't work either. So producers couldn't get their act together. Who could have gotten the act together? You could argue and say, look, you just need a big B2B customer who could have solved the problem. Who could that big B2B customer be? The government, in the form of the War Department or the Post Office, or for that matter, fire departments. Now, in France, it is true that the government played a very important role. The first customer of the automobile industry was actually the French military. But if you look at the American military, they actually were very slow to get into the car. They only got in 1909, 1910. And Henry Ford, of course, began production in 1912, or mass production then. And even in 1909, 1910, when the government began buying cars, it was in very small quantities. Then you can say, well, you could have had a professional society. They could establish standards. They could fix the problem. But you look at the Society of Automotive Engineers, their standards committee only met in 1911. And what they were concerned about was the standards with respect to car components and parts, because lots of car manufacturers were assembly operations. You may be astonished to know that the number of firms that actually produced automobiles for commercial purposes in the United States from the period 1895 to 1912 numbers around 1,800 firms. That is a lot of firms, okay? So in this milieu, there's all this concern about the car. The cars of dubious stature, if you will. How did the car begin to be established? And this is where I want to draw your attention to automobile enthusiasts who formed automobile clubs. What did they do? They were actually members of the local elite. Early purchasers of cars were physicians, because they'd move around a lot. They needed the car. They and people like that, they banded together. They attorneys too. So they banded together and formed automobile clubs. And they rapidly mushroomed. So 1901, there were 22. By 1910, there were 225 clubs. So what were these clubs? They were primarily self-help societies. You exchanged information, and the idea was to protect car drivers and car owners from legal harassment, because somebody could actually create a problem for you. And the other thing was they actually wanted good roads. By 1904, The Horseless Age, I might add, it's a wonderful magazine to read. It actually is a forerunner of, Bits and Bytes and all the magazines we see about computing. The Horseless Age actually was started in 1895. That's how I got interested in this. I once got off on the wrong floor of a library, and when I went there, I saw this Horseless Age, and I said, hey, I better read this. And then very quickly I realized this is worth kind of looking into. And of course, we collected a bunch of data and submitted them to statistical analyses, but I won't bore you with the statistical details. So the Horseless Age at that time says, it's difficult to find motorists who haven't formed a club. And it's hard to find a consumer who's not a member of such a club. What did these clubs do? They were very smart. The first thing is they lobbied state governments for statewide speed limits. Because if every municipality issued an ordinance, you could have potentially a lot of confusion. People wouldn't know what speeds to travel. Remember, you didn't have signage there then. So lots of confusion. So they lobbied a state and said, look, this is the minimum or maximum speed at which a car ought to travel. The second thing they did in order to undercut opposition from anti-speed activists, the farmers and the others, was let's actually establish laws for driver licensing, car registration. And once state governments realized, hey, these could be sources of revenue, they certainly kind of got interested. And who told them about the revenue potential of all of this? It was the automobile clubs. They said, look, you license cars, you register them, you charge taxes, you do all of this, you can actually make a little bit of money. And of course, you establish laws. The other thing was they also lobbied the federal government and state governments for good roads. If you didn't have roads, you couldn't have had a car. And these people were the primary motive force. Most important of all, they organized what are called reliability contests. So what was a reliability contest? It actually consisted of a hill climbing run. You climb this mountain, or an endurance run. Drive from San Francisco to LA, or in those days, Cleveland, New York, or Boston, New York, or whatever. But the interesting thing was they featured cars that could be bought by consumers like you and me. It was not speed races where specially designed monstrosities were featured. It's ordinary cars that you and I could buy. So what's the advantage? The first thing is you're creating a public spectacle. You're creating excitement. People come to watch this. Who's there? Potential customers are there. Who's also there? Potential inventors also are there. So they're looking at how cars are doing, what you can do, all of these things. And the other thing is, remember, misleading advertising? What was credible proof of quality? If you won a race, you could actually demonstrate quality. And so the wonderful line, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. And in fact, so important was reliability, the first advertising line for the Cadillac was, when you buy a Cadillac, you buy a round trip. So it's going to get you to your destination and back. So these reliability contests became tests that told consumers about the quality of cars. Buick actually had their advertising campaign completely dedicated to this. We actually have data on the exact day when these reliability contests occurred, who participated, all of these things. And of course, the first one was in 1895, and the last one was in 1912. And why did they discontinue reliability contests? Because by 1912, they were superfluous. There was simply no need. As somebody said, the automobile became entrenched in popular vocabulary. You didn't need anybody to talk about the car. The car became, by then, unquestioned. And that was when Henry Ford said, hey, I have a mass market, and he mass-produced cars. So that's a picture of the very first reliability contest. This is in Chicago, Thanksgiving Day, 1895. And who sponsored it? The Chicago Times-Herald. Who actually helped administer it? The automobile clubs in Chicago. And the print is a little small. There were 6 vehicles. You had to go from Chicago to Evanston and back. It was a distance of about 50 miles. Cold November. The electrics quickly dropped out because their batteries died. The Mercedes-Benz, or the Benz automobiles also broke down. It was the Derriere that actually made it at a rate of 10 miles per hour. It actually crossed the finish line at 7 p.m. The race took 9 hours. 9 hours to go from downtown Chicago, Lakeshore Drive, Evanston, and back. So what happened to races like this? They got featured in the media. They got extraordinary coverage, and that's how names like Derriere and the others burst into public consciousness. So this is another famous race. This was at that time called the race of the century. This was the upstart Henry Ford competing with Alexander Winton in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, 1901. So that's Winton. He was the more established car producer. Ford was driving his own car right there, and he was the underdog. Winton's car developed mechanical trouble, and Ford beat him, and that's kind of what caused Ford's surge. And look at Henry Ford's wife, Clara, her description of the scene in a letter to her brother when Ford crosses Winton. She says, the people went wild. One man threw his hat up, and when it came down, he stamped on it. Another man had to hit his wife on the head to keep her from going off the handle. She stood up in her seat, screamed, I'd bet $50 on Ford if I had it. So you can imagine the kind of scenario that was kind of created there. So that was another endurance run. This was a company called the Columbia Motor Company. And typically, those were the kinds of advertisements that were actually released. So what did we do? We actually gathered statistical data on every American producer. We found out who participated in these races, who won, and we wanted to find out what was actually their effect. We, of course, couldn't gather much data on their sales. At that time, companies didn't obviously keep all of this information and make it available for, in public databases. But the one thing we know is whether a company survived or not. And the interesting thing, if you won a bunch of races, you lived far longer. Now, we can't kind of conclude simply because you won a race, you were inherently of better quality. You were perceived to be of better quality because reputations are very path dependent. Because how many races you win depends on how many races you entered and who else participates in the race. So if you won the first couple of races, like Ford did, very quickly your reputation is on the upswing. Resources flow to you. You can enter more races. You can produce more cars. So what matters are early wins are decisive. But who won early was a matter of chance. So that's why it's path dependent. And indeed, that's kind of what we find. And in fact, when we did a number of statistical analyses that I won't bore you with, we also find the rich stayed rich. Because once you won, you continued to win. It was hard for newcomers to win. So this became, in effect, if you will, a powerful kind of entry barrier. So what's the point of all of this? Sorry. The point of all of this is it wasn't Henry Ford who actually made mass production possible. It wasn't collective action by producers. It wasn't the invisible hand of the market. It really was the automobiling movement, and it was small auto clubs. And if you read a wonderful book by Alec de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, what does this Frenchman say about America? He says, it's a wondrous land, and its striking characteristic is the ability of Americans to construct and form little associations. Automobile clubs were one outcropping of this associational kind of tendency. That's how they transformed the American automobile industry. Now, we can of course extend this to a number of instances, but given the time constraints we have, let me move on to my second example. And this is a very different kind of example again of where a social movement powers the creation of a new niche. And this is the craft brewing movement in the United States. So if you go back to your traditional, your microeconomics books, basically what do they tell you? When you have lots of concentration, entry into any market is difficult. High concentration, it leads to all kinds of entry barriers. So in the American beer industry, the big three, Busch, Coors, SAB, of course. Now, as you can see, Busch has been bought over by Interbev and so on and so forth. They control 98% of the market share. Yet, September 26, 1997 was a very interesting day in the American brewing industry because on that day, the Beer Institute actually announced that the United States actually had more independently owned breweries than Germany, even though Germany had 1/3 the level of market concentration. How's that possible? How is it in a highly concentrated industry you have the proliferation of small entrepreneurs? How was that feasible? They can't enter these markets. They don't have the resources. They don't have advertising. They don't have scale economies. They have none of these things. How could they actually get into the market? The reason, I will argue, was the craft brewing movement. Brewing, of course, has actually, has a wonderful history. In the world, there's actually a very interesting anthropological debate as to whether people first stayed in places because they grew grain or because they brewed beer. So actually in the anthropology of food, this is a healthy controversy. So beer and community are very closely linked together. And in pre-Prohibition America, you had lots of diverse beers, primarily fueled by immigration from Germany into the United States. There, of course, you had the Prohibition movement, the Anti-Saloon League and the others, who quickly took on the beer industry and stopped it right in its tracks. And what helped the Prohibition movement was World War I. Because who were many of the beer makers? They were of German origin. And so, if you actually look at the advertisements of the Anti-Saloon League and all of the Prohibition players, they'll tell you, look, it's unpatriotic to drink beer. Because if you drink beer, it's like sending a donation to the Kaiser in Germany. We might laugh at all of this, but it was kind of a very serious issue at that time. So you can see that the Prohibition movement had, if you will, a xenophobic tendency. And after that, all of us know the story. The big three producers came and dominated the market. How did this change? And the answer has to do with what I would argue is a hot cause and cool mobilization. See, when you want to change an established industry, what you need is a hot cause. What's a hot cause? It's a cause that stirs emotion. And because you stir emotion, you challenge beliefs. I'm sure all of you remember meetings in your organizations where one of your colleagues got really mad. Well, why did the person get mad? Because your beliefs are actually getting challenged. And so emotion and belief are very closely connected. Now, a hot cause by itself is not enough. You also need cool techniques of mobilization. What do I mean by cool techniques? Something that's unconventional, that's insurgent, that's rebellious, that's collective. When you have both, you create what one sociologist refers to as wunk. What's wunk? Worthiness. The feeling that you're pursuing a worthy cause. You're unified, you have lots of numbers, and you feel very committed to the cause. You need a lot of wunk. So, hot cause, cool techniques of mobilization. So let's actually look at this in the context of the brewing movement, or the craft brewing movement. You need hot cause and cool mobilization because it solves a big problem in collective action that I refer to as the B2B problem. For many of us, B2B means business to business. For me, the real question there is, do beliefs lead to behavior, or does behavior lead to belief? That's the B2B question for me. Remember, if you're in a movement, whom are you facing? An audience that's distracted, disinterested. They have little cognitive resources to devote to your cause. They got lots of things going on in their minds. They got their daily lives. And remember about you have very few resources. You don't have much authority. Yet, you got to mobilize them. Okay? That's your challenge. Now, one way in which you get people to do things is you change their beliefs. So if I change your belief, the argument is you're going to engage in new behavior. And what gets you to change that belief? It's the hot cause, in part. It sounds like a nice thing, but if you only focus attention on changing beliefs, you won't necessarily get behavior. Lots of us have great beliefs about the environment. That doesn't mean we behave in ways that are designed to, of course, improve the cause of the environment. The real challenge is behavior. You get people to do things, and the way you get them to do things is cool mobilization, then you get into new beliefs. You need both. And in fact, a great example of an organization that exploits this linkage from behavior to belief is Alcoholics Anonymous. What does Alcoholics Anonymous do? When an alcoholic becomes a member, they're not going to try and convince you booze is bad. Instead, what are they saying? Come to a meeting. In fact, they have a wonderful line. Let the body come to a meeting, the soul will follow later. That means your beliefs will follow later. So what's the point? Come to a meeting. What happens in a meeting? You look at a bunch of other people who have similar problems. You look at how they're solving them. You make a friendship. Every time you think of going to a bar, you suddenly call this new friend. That person prevents you. And slowly you get this new set of beliefs going. Back to homebrewing. How did the microbrewing or craft brewing movement start? It all has to do with home brewing. President Carter legalized home brewing in 1979, but a year before that, you had a wonderful activist called Charles Papazian. And what he was doing was, he was an avid home brewer. He was teaching people how to brew. And he started, this teaching lesson flowered into a newsletter called Zymurgy, and you can actually see issues of Zymurgy. And then very quickly, the newsletter became an organization called the American Homebrewers Association. So as more and more people joined the association, they established a beer town university. Entrepreneurs were beginning to be spun off, and by then microbrewers split off as a division of the American Homebrewers Association. So what was the interesting thing for microbrewers? The hot cause for them was big beer. What was the critique of big beer? It's their enemy. It's a source of thin, tasteless, watery, and overcarbonated beer. It's a source of inebriation rather than taste. And here's a line from Michael Jackson, which says, beer suffers from the sophomoric image promoted by the big three. Their marketing promotes the image of beer as tough. When Bud Light comes along and says, choose on taste, you're left wondering, okay, what does it taste like? So that was the hot cause. And the other thing was homogeneity. Why should you drink the same kind of beer everywhere? Why can't we have diversity? Now, what was their cool technique of mobilization? Lots of different things they did. There's a lovely billboard, by the way, by this chap called Bob Connors of the Independence Brewing Company. He had a billboard that said, independence, enjoy it while it lasts. The beer, I mean, as well as independence from the big three. So, this is another call. Wake up. You have taste buds, you have a mind. Don't be a slave to the advertisements of the big three. So that's one of the first microbrews, the New Albion. The cool mobilization was organizing festivals. What was the effect of festivals? First, they were fun. Who actually came to festivals? Potential consumers came to festivals. Entrepreneurs came to festivals. They exhibited their wares. They won prizes. They developed reputations. The other thing is they exchanged ideas. Because if you were in Portland, you weren't competing with somebody necessarily in Boston. And their point was, you need to be small. You actually have to engage in artisanal production, using authentic ingredients, and usually you've got to make beer on the very premises. So hence brew pubs. They began to flower. My colleague Glenn Carroll, in fact, has actually done a number of statistical analyses of the brewing industry, and you can actually see this. As the movement becomes more powerful and as concentration increases, the establishment of microbrewing operations actually explodes in the United States. It just darts all over. You look at the map of the U.S., brew pubs, microbrews, craft production, they're established all over. Now, back to WUNC, worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. In a talk, Gary Fish, a president of a brewery, said, look, there's an old Chinese proverb that says, enough shovels of earth, a mountain, enough pails of water, a river. And he said, we are that mountain, we are that river. By 1994, you had 500 establishments. By 1997, you had more than, as I mentioned earlier, 1,200 establishments in the United States producing craft beers. So what did the big companies do? They said, my God, this is a new niche. We never knew such a niche existed. Remember, microbrews aren't cannibalizing demand for big beer. They simply established a new niche. The overall market grew, and that's when big beer said, boy, we got to get into this. So what did they do? The first thing they did is, let's establish a division. We'll make our own microbrews, of course. So they had their own specialty brewing divisions. That didn't work too well. Then they said, you know what? Maybe we need to take equity positions in a couple of microbrews. So, and then you had contract brewers. What they said was, you really don't need to make beer. You can outsource all of this. And what was amazing was the microbrewing people got together and said, hey, you are an imposter if you don't make beer on your premises. So they would out them. They were vigilantes who actually outed these kinds of contract brewers and microbrews with equity positions from big beer. So at that time, I might add, one investment bank forecasted that contract brewers would outcompete microbrewers. You have lower costs, you could grow faster because you had more scale. And what the microbrewers did is they exposed all of these effects as inauthentic. Fritz Maytag put it well. I want to make all our beer right here in this building, hands-on. And he said, and then there are the folks, the farming out companies who contract with different breweries. I hate to be pejorative, but a contract brewer is a marketing company. We are the real brew makers. And again, we've done a number of statistical analyses I won't go into. And what you'll see is, as a result of all this outing and exposure and vigilante behavior, contract brewers actually plummeted in the United States, and it was the microbrews who did well. Now, let me kind of turn to the third example. We'll finish this and then we'll have Q&A. Here, I'm actually going to focus on how activists can block innovation in markets. Here, I'm assuming that the Walmart superstore is actually an innovative format. I'm not passing a value judgment here. That's certainly what Walmart thought. And the question is, what's the role of activists here? So if you talk to colleagues in political economy, economists who construct what are called equilibrium models, they'll tell you, look, at equilibrium, there should not be any protest. Why is that the case? Because if you're a savvy activist, whom do you target? You're actually going to go after a target who's going to give in even before you protested. They're going to say, my God, you're going to protest? What do you want us to do? We'll do all this. Right? That's what you ought to do if you're a savvy activist. On the other hand, if you're a firm, what do you need to do to avoid being a target? You either cave in quickly or you become super tough. And they say, look, you mess with me, we're going to be all over you. In that case, are they going to target you? No. So in either case, if targets are going to fall into two categories, the easy exceeders and the really tough people, you shouldn't have any protest, right? And if it occurs, it ought to be a rare miscalculation. That's the prediction. I won't bore you with all the kind of math there, but that's the core kind of prediction. So let's actually take a look at this model and then think of Walmart. So if you look at Walmart, between the period 1998 to 2005, they had 1566 proposals to start new stores. Many of them were supercenters, around somewhere between 170 to 220,000 square feet kinds of operations. 1,008 of them, or 64% of these proposals to start a store, they didn't encounter a protest. So, it's not that Walmart is an easy target that everybody can go after. Okay? So, Walmart opened stores in 845 of these places. So, they had a good... So, when there was no protest, 83% of the time, they opened a store. But what about when they faced a protest? Here, Walmart was unable to overcome protests in 64% of the cases. Clearly, the protesters are winning. Often. Question is how? Protests exist. So the real question is, when do these protests arise and when do they succeed? This is a study that we are currently conducting, as I mentioned earlier, with Paul Ingram, my collaborator at Columbia, and Laurie Yu, who is a graduate student there as well. So let's actually look at this a little bit. So that's a picture of Walmart. But there was a lovely article in Forbes magazine. It said, who's Walmart's biggest enemy? It's not the number 2 retail chain in the world, Carrefour. It's this guy, Al Norman. Al Norman, of course, is a stand-in for activists in the anti-sprawl movement. Norman actually spearheaded the first protest against Walmart in Massachusetts when they tried to open a supercenter in his store. And then he set up a site called Sprawl Busters. So these are all the places they wanted to start stores. So those are the protest places. And that's kind of where they eventually opened stores. So let's kind of find this out a little bit more. But first, back to hot cause and cool mobilization. What's the hot cause? Sprawl. And the hot cause is protect our small town. Because lots of times these stores were being located in towns with populations that varied anywhere between 5,000 to 30,000. There's actually a great, there are all kinds of accounts of what it means to be an anti-sprawl activist. I wanted to give you a flavor of an extreme anti-sprawl activist, James Kunstler. So this is what he says. People who shop at a giant discounter to save $7 on a hairdryer don't realize they pay a hidden price by taking that business from local merchants. Because it's these merchants who sit on school boards, who sponsor Little League and support the civic institutions that create the community. Our town, our small community is the precious thing. And how does he describe Walmart? It's an example of colonialism which engages in cultural strip mining. So this is another powerful line that he actually gave actually at a talk at TED. He says, we have 38,000 places that aren't worth caring about in the United States. When we have enough of them, we're going to have a nation that's not worth defending. And I want you to think about that when you think about those young men and women who are over in places like Iraq, spilling their blood in sand, and you ask yourself, what is their last thought of home? I hope it's not the curb cut between the Chuck E. Cheese and the Target store. Because that's not good enough for Americans to be spilling their blood for. That's a very extreme view and very passionate view of what the anti-sprawl activists are all about. Cool mobilization. So, how do they do that? Petitions, marches, pledges, creating our town organizations, and quickly organizing popular votes on size caps. A size cap is a zoning measure which says, sure, you can have a new store, but it can't be more than 35,000 square feet. The footprint can't be bigger than that. Because what they're worried about, in a small town is once you have a supercenter, you have a big traffic lot, congestion, on and on and on. Now, one of the interesting things, of course, for this kind of cool mobilization, where did they occur? Where did these protests occur? The first thing is in small, highly educated towns with low ethnic diversity. High education is important. The other thing that's very, very important, we found out statistically, is it's very important for protests to also arise in neighboring towns. Why is that? You're a small town of 5,000, you're facing a powerful corporation. If you actually nix that corporation's effort to open a store, what's the corporation going to do? They're going to say, okay, you don't want a store? Fine. We'll put it in the neighboring town. And guess what? It's so close to you, it'll actually compete with your main street, and you're going to be affected. So you have a choice. So in order to get around that, very important for towns to actually engage in a regional kind of strategy to sort of thwart them. And indeed, that's kind of what happened. The other thing, by the way, is when did protests succeed? Protests succeeded again in highly educated towns. And again, protests were far more successful when there were protests in the neighboring towns. In fact, if any time there was a proposal, protests reduced the probability of store opening to 51%. So, they have a big, big effect. What about when protests failed? When they couldn't stop Walmart from opening a store? And here, we're operating with far more limited data. One of the things that Walmart does when it opens a store is it gives donations to the local community, to local organizations. In places where the protests failed and Walmart opened a store, they actually give more money to the local community. Not by a lot, but certainly it's a little more money than was there. So what the activists are doing is they indeed are able to thwart store openings, and in places where they don't succeed, the community gets a little bit of a return in the form of more donations from Walmart. When we take these three quick cases together, what's the upshot? Hopefully, I've managed to present to you some evidence, hopefully compelling, that rebels matter. They not only create new industries like the automobile industry or new niches like microbrewing, but they can also restrict markets. Walmart, of course, is an example of that. Hot causes and cool mobilization, that's kind of what makes movements go. And so one of the things is when we think of markets, we've got to stop being inattentive, stop neglecting the joined hands of activists. Our natural tendency is to gravitate to the visible hand of great men, but it's the joined hands of activists that actually play a very big role. So, hopefully, that was a clear enough account of what the research is all about, what indeed the book is all about. I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have, comments, and the like. Yep. Yeah.
As you were talking about this, I was thinking about the Obama campaign. That's a kind of a macro social movement.
Absolutely.
It hits both in terms of new markets, like in the current proposal in Congress for new spending, and also restricts markets. I mean,
right.
It's addressing both simultaneously.
Right.
So I'm curious if you were able to make use of those kind of macro political movements within this kind of model, and what kind of ways they speed up or slow down the kind of process you're talking about.
There's actually certainly striking similarity between macro movements directed, at the whole of society and movements that happen in industries. But if you look at those movements, they're also animated by, if you will, hot causes and cool, techniques of mobilization too. In the you mentioned the current crisis. The interesting challenge, of course, is there's a lot of free-floating anxiety, extraordinary anxiety. And in a situation like this, typically what happens is any issue can become a lightning rod issue and actually conduct, if you will, and in a sense, channel all of the free-floating anxiety and potential anger as well. See, the emotions that are aroused in any movement are anger towards a particular target and pride. So the interesting sort of question is, what's the emotion that needs to be harnessed? I think is a very important kind of question. So that's the important thing to do. Yep.
Yeah, I work for a consulting firm that specializes on the demand side
Uh-huh.
of the clean tech economy. And we sort of work with companies to help them accelerate their consumer piece. A lot of this is really interesting. Most interesting thing you're talking about is the beliefs. And there has been so much challenging people's understanding and beliefs about what's necessary. There's so much confusing information. How would you start to even begin to apply some of this to that kind of a paradigm?
Yeah. The first thing I think is it helps to, you really need this kind of hot cause. And the question is, what is the hot cause? We talk about, clean tech, for example. One of the things I talk about in my book was why the effort to have the electric car, for example, in California, why that didn't go forward. You could have expected that it would have, because after all, the government said, hey, car producers have to actually make electric cars available. The other thing was celebrities endorsed them. You could have thought, my God, celebrity endorse. What's that?
And you had a very active user.
You had at that time. I'm talking of when they were making the RAV, the Toyota RAV, GM was making its. Yeah, right. So you had all of that. It never sort of took off. Well, one argument as to why it didn't take off, captured, dramatically in the movie Who Killed the Electric Car is, ergo conspiracy, And of course, big oil had its own role. certainly auto producers were diffident. But your question kind of, points attention to the fact that what you need is, you really need some way to actually mobilize consumer interest. And that was the problem. And there are two problems, as I see it, with the environmental cause. One of the things is there's actually a literature in social psychology called moral derogation. So when you come up with something that's kind of called, quote, a good virtuous cause, people can kind of begin to discount it precisely because it's a good virtuous kind of cause. So there is this, that's kind of what's referred to as moral derogation. So the real challenge there, as I see it, is not changing the beliefs as much as actually getting behavior change. And I think where the potential sources are, to me, high schools, middle schools, all of these places where you can actually have a big impact. You can have a huge effect on the behavior of adults by actually affecting their children. This was very dramatically illustrated to me when we actually were doing a study of the anti-biotechnology movement in Germany. This wasn't a big movement, 100 people at most. What were they doing? They were actually taking on German pharmaceutical companies that had biotechnology knowledge. Germany, West Germany then, this is pre-reunification, they didn't have a biotech sector and so on and so forth. The pharma companies were doing this. And the amazing thing was, how could they do that? And we interviewed scientists in these labs for, Bayer and BASF and Herbst and so forth. And I still remember talking to a couple of the scientists. I said, why are you guys so reluctant to work on biotechnology? And I remember one guy at, one of the companies looking at me, saying, Professor, anti-biotechnology activists are very active in schools. Many school teachers are anti-biotechnology activists. My kids go to those schools. Do you think I'm actually going to have a dinner conversation at home when my daughter or son ask me, Dad, what are you doing? And I'm going to say biotechnology, and they're going to say, whoa, that's eugenics. That's actually a return to the Nazi era, because those were the claims being made. So the schools and so forth, they can be very, very powerful. So you really have to think of more indirect sort of approaches. The other thing is getting people to change their behavior, getting them to do small things. Very small things are the way to kind of get people to do this, not the sort of big thing. It's sort of often small commitments, yeah.
Clearly you've done a lot of research in the birth of the automobile industry.
Right.
I'm wondering what your research would tell you about what happens from here forward with automobiles. How these kinds of models, how do you think they'll play out in automobiles or the function automobiles provide to us, that transportation function? What's going to happen?
Yeah, good question. At this very moment, there are a number of potential pathways. One pathway is, first, you can actually see people with great interest in the automobile industry, the fossil fuel-based automobile industry, seeking to kind of organize to protect their interests. There are lots of people who have an interest in doing that, and they may indeed kind of organize to change laws, to change public opinion, and the like. That's kind of one possibility. The other possibility is you can actually have others who see this as a great opportunity. They might do that. So there's going to be a lot of competition, I would forecast, about laws, regulation, and the like. That's going to be one big kind of area. Another sort of big area, I think, is, I would think, there may be, how shall I put it, renewed interest in mega projects, public transit systems and the like, and so on and so forth. What form and shape that takes, one wouldn't kind of know, but that's there as well. But remember, all of this is against the backdrop of a very powerful anti-sprawl movement. It's very, very powerful in the United States. So you have lots of small communities. Where I live in Menlo Park, when you had the high-speed train link between LA and San Francisco, my God, you got to see all the meetings that people kind of turned up for. And so I suspect you'd find heightened mobilization. Which of them would succeed at this stage, I won't be able to offer you an informed kind of conjecture. But I certainly sort of see that. I suspect that people are going to also play an important role. I would think are really the younger generation who are mobilizing through all kinds of ways. Twitter, the mobilization technologies are very, very different. It's not the old-fashioned ways in which the old social movements did all of that. A lot of it is electronic. In fact, I would think that you certainly would have face-to-face contact, but I could easily see clubs on Facebook, for example, becoming great kind of breeding grounds for collective action and the like. There was somebody else. You had the floor, and then you'll have the floor, ma'am. Yeah, you raised it. Yeah.
Your three examples seem to be sort of spontaneous movements.
Uh-huh.
Because there wasn't a central organizer
Right.
who said, okay,
Right.
we're going to create these movements and cause a change. Do you have other examples where there was a central organizer who said, hey, I'm going to take advantage of this kind of an approach to affect an outcome?
Uh-huh. Yeah, by a central organizer, are you sort of implying by that a corporation or an organization?
Corporation, a government, or I suppose an individual?
Yeah. I think the danger with collective action that kind of sustains, is at this decentralized kind of grassroots level. Typically, when something is kind of controlled, if you will, by a central organization, you certainly have examples of that. In the case of the union movement, for instance, you actually have the Service International Union, which is a central body. They work with activists in lots of plants, and they help things move. So that's certainly one example there. On the other hand, if I switch to the corporate side, savvy firms realize that we actually don't want to get too close. We can actually help them a little bit. We can be very complimentary. And the example that instantly crossed my mind when you asked that question was Harley Davidson. Think of the turnaround at Harley. I might add, within Harley, it actually took on the form of a social movement. You weren't just doing a little financial turnaround. You were really restoring, if you will, reclaiming an American icon, so to speak, internally within the firm. What was happening to the consumers? They began to spontaneously form a number of Harley clubs and the like. And that's when Harley kind of said, you know what? We don't need to kind of go there and muddy the waters. We can actually help them. So, they want to go to Sturgis. We can actually kind of help them. We can provide them some facilities. We can do all of this. We can get users in touch with each other. We can do all of that. But the motivational force has to actually kind of come from them. Sometimes what can also happen is a corporation can be completely taken aback. A great example is the popular upsurge when the Coca-Cola company withdrew, classic Coke. And they came with new Coke. You can imagine what kind of firestorm that created. And the Coke guy said, my God, what do we do? And it's amazing how many people began to organize and do things and so forth. So the smart thing for large corporations is what the small movements can do is they can kind of point to new niches. They can make you realize new opportunities. Think of the big cereal companies. Did they realize organic foods was a big viable niche? Well, it was only after the movement took off, they said, you know what? Boy, we better kind of get into that. And doing acquisitions and a bunch of things. But of course, there we kind of get into the capability of firms and so forth. Yes, you had raised your hand.
Two questions. The first is there a critical number of people involved that was enough to sustain
Uh-huh.
the movement? And then the second question I have is, did media play any particular role, or did it dilute the impact? If it made it to television or made it to newspaper,
Uh-huh.
or they used some form of media
Absolutely. Let me take the second question first. Media have a big role. What do media do?
Well, and how do they attract that media? I mean, if they
Right.
want to.
Right, they indeed do that. They have a big role. They amplify, attention. They circulate news. They make things kind of much, much more visible. So a small protest in a neighborhood or a locality, you get TV coverage in our syndicated kind of world. It can quickly travel kind of very far. So media of all kinds, not just TV and newspapers, but all media. They have a big amplifying role. In terms of numbers, the normal thing we think of when we think of a movement is, boy, we got to see a movement in the streets. And really, when you see some movements, you really don't need to be in the streets. In fact, our research on the anti-biotechnology movement in West Germany, our paper that just is coming out this week in the American Sociological Review is called From Streets to Suites. How does something get from the street to the corporate suite? So take that as an example. Now, there we counted all of the activists who were there, opposed to anti-biotechnology. When we did a detailed census, we could not come with more than 100 people at the most. Now, is that a large movement? Obviously not. Very small. So the interesting thing is, how did such a small movement have such a disproportionately large effect? On whom? The German pharmaceutical industry. Remember, Germany always has been known as the pharmacy to the world. In the 1970s and the early 1980s, the German governments, be it Christian Democratic or Social Democrat, they said, we want leadership in biotechnology. They established new institutes, all of these things. There was no venture capital sector in Germany then, no dedicated biotechnology sector. All the action was in the German pharma companies. They had lots of patents. In fact, per capita, the Germans had more patents in biotechnology at that time than even the United States. They were poised to really go great, yet they couldn't do very much. How could they not do it? And what was interesting was, if you look at this 100 activists, they were really a very motley crew. You had feminists. In fact, there's a group called the Rote Zura. It's a Red Army faction only of feminists. They would kind of burn down, biotechnology labs and the like. You had, at the other extreme, extremely conservative Catholic theologians who said, my God, you're messing with the sanctity of life. And in that spectrum, you had all kinds of activists. What did they do? The first thing they realized, in order to get media attention and the like, was connect biotechnology with eugenics and Nazi Germany. You do that, basically you've made a big thing. The second thing they would do was amazing. They would have a very small event, in some small town. So if you go, for example, this is near Dusseldorf. You have the Wuppertal Valley, for example. I'm trying to think of the name where Bayer is based at. It's in the Wuppertal Valley. The name will come to me. So small places, they would organize a debate. Let's talk about biotechnology. And whom would the pharma companies send? They'd send a scientist. Somebody who was going to give information about biotechnology to the crowd. Who would come to debate them? One of these 100 activists. And the interesting thing was, they would come to the debate dressed as a misshapen apple. Genetically transformed and, all of these things. Weird colors. And, you're sitting next to this guy, you're trying to debate him. It's like, there's no way, How can you debate somebody like that? You're trying to provide information to the crowd. They're not listening to him. They're not doing anything. They're like hypnotized by this person. And every time this person says, how could you kill people? I remember we interviewed some of the scientists, and they said we went there with information, and when I went for my first debate, I realized I had no chance. We didn't know how to deal with these people. And what would happen to that small debate? It would get televised, it would get amplified, it would have all of that. The other interesting thing that these people did was, all that they needed to do was delay regulatory approval. See, you didn't need to do very much. The regulators had to, you just need to delay it. And if you delayed it, what would happen? the firm is actually making a series of NPV calculations, payback period, all of these things are there. Suddenly all of that, people kind of say, wait a minute, why are we doing this? Who's on the board of many of the German pharma companies? They were part of conglomerates. The pharma division is part of the chemicals division. So there are 12 people on the management committee, 11 of them are the chemical guys, you're the only pharma guy, you got one vote. And they're looking at you and saying, you know what? We have 100 million Deutschmarks in those days. We can put it in the safe chemical investment. If we do it, we know the rate of return. Safe. This, terribly risky. Why are we going to put money into this? Forget it. So they really didn't do anything. It's very striking how powerful such a movement was. At exactly the same time, the United States Department of Commerce issued a report on biotechnology. The title of that report was Biotechnology, Opportunities. Exactly the same time, give or take a couple days. In Germany, they issued a report. This is the Bundestag then, the parliament. The title of the report was Biotechnology, Risks and Dangers. That tells you what's going to happen. So they were very, very skillful. Yep.
Oh, sorry. Just one more question about, is there any correlation between education, income, and the success of the people who are the sort of activists?
Uh-huh.
I noticed because the early adopters in the cars were the elite,
Right.
and successful towns with
Right.
Walmart were
Right.
highly educated.
Right. Great.
And just, I'm familiar with the Clean Green area. It's clearly a little bit more elite, high income.
Right.
So is that just an early adopter phenomenon, or is there something relevant here or significant?
No, that's a great question. The short answer is this is actually the subject of a big debate, if you will. Are diverse... No, seriously. But the evidence clearly is in favor of, if you will, homogeneous kinds of communities as opposed to particularly diverse communities. So if you have a very diverse community, it's hard to construct an identity, a cause that everybody could kind of rally around. On the other hand, if you have a homogeneous kind of community, easier for you to kind of do that. And that's kind of why in homogeneous communities, you typically have more collective action that's actually likely to take off. So that's the thing. So it's not whether it's the level of affluence. It's actually homogeneity is the underlying thing. You could actually have a community that's not affluent. But on the other hand, if they're homogeneous, you could actually have collective action that can quickly kind of, take root there as well. Yep, Mike.
When you look at something like, when you mentioned in the book the WTO protest being kind of what people often think about
Right.
in terms of activists, and what you saw there, it seems, is that people had a lot of different hot causes, and there was some people were against certain elements of globalization, some people were against big corporations, some people were against, and they somehow found a way to kind of do this cool mobilization. But because people were so diverse, it didn't last that long.
Very
So
true.
you find that generally, like if you have a hot cause that is a fairly uniting,
Right.
similar,
Right.
homogeneous
Right.
thing, that things can last longer.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Because otherwise, when you have a diverse group, you can have a lightning rod issue. Oh, the ministers, from the G8 are meeting. A whole bunch of people get together because that's kind of the lightning rod thing. It fuels. It connects with underlying kind of anger, grievances, sense of injustice, all of these kinds of things. But it really usually doesn't last for very long. See, the important thing, and I want to sort of keep in mind, some of you have questions too, is so one of the examples that I allude to in the book, and which I think is a very interesting example, is, I'm originally born in India. So if you go back to India, think of Gandhi. He's called Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma means great soul, hence Mahatma Gandhi. So think of Mahatma Gandhi in India. Look at the problem he had. How do you actually kind of get people to mobilize around the British? Control, lack of independence, and so forth. And remember, the bulk of the population is in the villages, 90%. Do they have access to radio? No. Newspapers? No. Do they have TV? No. No TV, no radio, none of those kinds of things. How do you actually kind of get them to mobilize? Very, very interesting. So let me give you two examples that kind of drive home what I mean. One was Gandhi instantly kind of realized that salt was something that could actually connect to the rural population in India. He took a bunch of people to a beach at a place called Dandi, and he said, look at the ocean. It's giving you salt. Does it belong to anybody? No. But yet, you have to pay tax to the British government. Why should you pay tax when it's your salt? And that made a lot of sense to people. So what was the easiest way for people to get into the independence movement? Make your own salt, changing behavior. Make your own little salt, march with me, another behavior, and then soon you quickly kind of realize and say, my God, we've got to do something about our lack of independence, sovereignty, and the like. So it's very simple things with high symbolic value that are very, very powerful. This was an example of people doing things. You can also use examples, or you can also make sure when people stop doing things, that can also be a cool kind of mobilization too. A great example, one of the viceroys in India divided a province into two along ethnic lines between the Hindus and the Muslims. This was in 1905, 1906 in India. How do you get a whole bunch of people concerned about that? And what was interesting was the way he kind of got public mobilization was, it wasn't the partition, it was too abstract for most people. Instead, the symbol was British cloth. So what was interesting was people actually wore machine-made cloth made in the UK. He would actually organize meetings, not only he and a number of other activists. People would come to the town square. What did you do in the town square? You took off your British-made clothes, consigned them to the flames, and you burnt them. And then what did you do? You actually wore fabric, the khadi, the fabric made by the artisan. And that's kind of how he established a connection between urban India and rural India. Because who was actually making most of the khadi, the cloth, the artisans? They were all mostly in rural India. So if you were in Calcutta, how do you establish that sense of oneness, unity, all of these things? So he sought to traverse, if you will, demographic distance, income distance, all of these things, through these symbols. They're very, very powerful. And what I think savvy, activists realize is it can actually have huge effects. And if we have a chance, maybe after we break, we can actually, talk a little bit about how movements also can transform not just markets, but organizations. We've just finished writing a case on a wonderful little campaign called Save 100,000 Lives. What's the problem here? Approximately 100,000 people a year die because of preventable medical errors in hospitals. So if you go to any hospital and say, hey, I'm very interested in talking to you about deaths caused by preventable medical errors, you know what's going to await you. They'll say, go meet my attorney, I don't want to talk to you. And who's actually started this? This is an example of a small organization, no authority. You've got 100 people. You're in Boston, Cambridge. You got no clout, no money, nothing. And what's kind of interesting is, it was kind of fascinating as I was writing this case study. These guys want to take this on. They've actually had a big effect. I flew to Boston along with our wonderful case writer Dave Hoyt, also an alum of GSB. And we went there, and I remember asking the founder of the Institute for Health Improvement. I said, when you were starting this, whom did you get advice from? And of course, naively, I thought he might have, visited people at a business school or something. And he looked at me and he said, the first person we met was Gloria Steinem. I said, really? I said, why? He said, well, she's organized collective action. I said, that's true. What did you learn from her? She said, name the enemy and increase numbers. You need lots of numbers. That's what they learned. Then I said, who else did you consult? And he looked at me and he said, well, I spoke to my son. I said, really? Why? He said, my son was the campaign organizer for John Kerry in Florida. And I said, and what did you learn from your son? He said, my son asked me, what do you want to do? And the father told the son, we want to save lives. How many? He said, some. And he said, when? And he said, soon. And that's when the son said, Dad, I come from the world of campaigning. We have a very specific number, 50.1%. You got to turn that number out. They got to vote. We know exactly when we need to do it by. And that's when he told his dad, some is not a number, soon is not a time. And they came up then with their campaign called Save 100,000 Lives. They started this in 2004. And, do it by December 30th or whatever it is of 2006. Of course, their campaign didn't achieve all of this. People in hospitals did. What made it possible for people in hospitals to connect? They actually got parents, who lost their young children to medical errors in a big convention. So they began to build support. They identified 6 evidence-based ideas, like, washing your hands, every time you're in a hospital and, so on and so forth. Simple ideas like that. They got them and they asked hospitals to sign up onto this campaign. Within, I think, 3 months, 3,400 hospitals signed up in this campaign. And look at their unconventional techniques. I actually went and visited them. They were doing a radio show. And they had the former head of NPR's health desk, National Public Radio's, health section. She was kind of, if you will, the DJ behind the radio show. It's very simple technology. If I recall rightly, everybody had called into this radio show using WebEx. It's a simple kind of technology. They called in. You know what? There must have been 400 hospitals on that phone call. And it's extraordinary amount of information, energy, all of these things. So they actually have had great success. So one of the counter questions that I posed to the IHI achievers when they succeeded, their campaign succeeded. Of course, they didn't do it all by themselves. The hospitals did, and they're very, very careful to say that. The interesting question is, why did this succeed? The movement worked. But the other interesting thing is, whom did it mobilize? And if you really look at frontline care in America, many nurses it's a gendered job. Most of them are women. A lot of the quality jobs in hospitals are also held by women. And so one possibility which we don't know is, perhaps it succeeded because in the front lines it was largely a women's movement in hospitals. We don't know yet. And so arguably they were very wise in consulting Gloria Steinem, as they did very, very early on. So lots of examples like that. Again, the point is we can do this in firms too. Successful CEOs realize that. And I think that's kind of what they need to kind of figure out. You got to get away from the tired PowerPoint presentation. You give people 55 facts. When I look at people and say, God, how many PowerPoint slides do you have in your deck? And the guy says, 30? You lost it already. It takes you 30 slides to get across your point. God, you better rethink this real quick, Because a hard cause is something that's got to get across like that. And a good test is, does your 8-year-old get it? If your 8-year-old gets it, I think you're on the way to doing something interesting. Otherwise, it's not going to go real far. But that's a separate kind of topic. We're at 7:30, and I think we need to end as well. So I hope you found all of this relevant, engaging, and interesting. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.